3, 2.
Hey, everybody. I'm John Pierce, U.S. Sailing Youth Director. Welcome to this U.S. Sailing Leadership Forum session. We're really excited to be having a group here that's going to talk about safety in sports medicine, race management, working with government, and managing youth programs. And we hope it's going to be a productive and thoughtful session here. I see that we're already taking roll call in the chat box. That's great. Please use the chat box as your place for questions, and we'll be taking note of some of the frequently asked questions in the chat box and using that for the end of the session. So without further ado, I'm going to move forward here and introduce our panelists and our agenda. So our first topic is going to be health and safety in sailing in 2020, led by Dr. Ann Allen. Dr. Allen, can you introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Ann Allen. I'm from Wrightsville Beach, North Carolina, and I've been involved with U.S. Sailing and Sports Medicine for a long time, and current chair of the Sailing Sports Medicine Committee, and look forward to speaking with y'all today.
Thanks, Ann. Thanks for being here. Our second topic is going to be on return to play and particularly getting out on the race course. And for that, we have Mark Townsend. Mark, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Mark Townsend. I'm from the West Coast, Alameda Bay Yacht Club. I'm an international judge, umpire, and race officer. I was also Commodore of ABYC a few years ago. So we're also looking at the perspective of not only the race management side, but the race organization side. Many of the challenges are in actually how you put the event together rather than how you actually get around the race course. So we'll try and cover those.
Fantastic. Thanks for being here, Mark. Our third topic will be proactive planning through reactivity by Brad Reid from Sail Newport. Brad, can you introduce yourself?
Thanks, John, and I'm glad to be with you all. And I'm Brad Reid, the Executive Director of Sail Newport. I've been at this post for 23 years. I'm also a member of the Rhode Island Sailing Committee, which is an events committee based up in Providence at the Capitol Hill. And I'm also a member of the Idlewild Yacht Club and the New York Yacht Club. And I'm happy to try to share what I've learned about how to talk to politicians.
Excellent, excellent. And then our fourth topic today will be about adapting junior sailing programs, and that'll be led by Jessica Haverstock. Jess, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, John. Jess Haverstock here from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm the director at the Lake Minnetonka Sailing School, and I've been a part of that program for a long time, the director for now over 8 years, and also the chair of the U.S. Sailing Instructor and Coaches Committee. So hopefully I can give you a little bit of a checklist to keep in mind as we're getting closer to summer.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jess. And, you know, I want to just remind everybody up front here that we thank you to those of you that are U.S. Sailing members, and we want to remind you to join U.S. Sailing or renew U.S. Sailing. This starboard portal, all of these resources that we're pulling together as quickly as we can are member benefit, and we want to bring the community together to get through this challenging time. So we appreciate your support. We appreciate all the fantastic volunteers and regional leaders who are coming together to help navigate this challenging situation. And I have a few U.S. Sailing updates before we start the presentation. Just a couple of short reminders. One of the things that's changing rapidly with U.S. Sailing's educational products is going online, not surprisingly. So the Level 1 online course is now a hybrid course with a online learning section that takes place over 10 days and lasts about 10 to 12 hours in total, followed by a 2-day in-person evaluation course. So that is now open to new registrants, and that means you can register for the online portion of the course and complete that, and then complete the 2-day in-person session when that is possible in your region of the country. So that's a great opportunity to continue your training and get ready for this season and make sure your instructor certifications are up to date. We've also released the Safety at Sea Online new modules 11 through 15, which is an extension of the previous modules. And there's a basic race management seminar, which is now online. That's a one-day seminar. It's been very popular thus far. And there's also additional race management courses that will be going online in the near future. So that's a great kind of innovation and a silver lining of this whole situation. Also, the COVID-19 resources. We are doing our best, along with all other kind of governing bodies, to produce guiding resources and documents to help our members navigate this situation. Just yesterday, we posted online a new junior sailing program guidance document, and that is available on our organization's membership page, also in the U.S. Sailing Leadership Forum Facebook group, which is online, and that's where a lot of these resources are landing on Facebook. Just today, Gallery Insurance reproduced their COVID-19 Burgee Program Risk Management Guide. So that is a great resource for insurance and liability. And that is also posted in the Sailing Leadership Forum Facebook group. And then coming soon is a return to competition guidance document to help with planning races and regattas and navigating the stepping stones towards holding a regatta in this climate. So stay tuned for more resources. If you have ideas and needs, we're assembling frequently asked question documents, and this will be an ongoing process, I'm sure, for quite some time. With that, I'm going to move on into the nitty gritty here. And just a quick disclaimer, we're bringing together experts here. We are gathering and compiling the best information available, but please keep in mind that none of this is a replacement for medical or legal advice from those professionals. And, you know, we are a sailing association, and so we are focused on sailing and getting on the water, but please use your other resources available to you in the medical and the legal areas to navigate this situation as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ann Allen, who is the chair of U.S. Sailing Sports Medicine Committee, to talk about health and safety in sailing.
Thanks, John. Y'all can hear me okay, I hope. I am a sports medicine physician and have worked with U.S. Sailing and America's Cup and Olympic and Paralympic sailors for years. And so we've had a lot of different experiences, not quite the same, but similar over time. And I think it's important to remember that, you know, we've had things such as exposures in Beijing during the Beijing Games in 2008, where there were a lot of issues with pollution, and we were having to have our runners evaluated from a pulmonary perspective, and our sailors and other athletes that were outdoor venues. We've had issues in Brazil with pollution. We've had similar kind of problems in a gastrointestinal viral situation, for instance, that may have come across in team sports, where we're having to address that within an America's Cup compound, or when the Volvo Ocean Race, for instance, was going to South Africa and there was a outbreak of dengue fever down there, and we had to deal with that. So there are different infectious situations that we've had to address, or pollutions that have affected us physically. Over the years, we've had to look at these, but this is a little different, I think, more because it hits us all so close to home. It's not as much of an isolated event. It's obviously a global pandemic, but we have to approach those things in a similar fashion, and try to make sure that we have our health and safety in consideration for not only ourselves, but all those around us. So as we go through this, I'm just going to kind of try to highlight some documents where I think there's some good information, and make some things specific for sailing, some documents that I think might be helpful, and go forward from there. So next slide, John. So just to remind you, this global pandemic, most everyone knows when it started, et cetera, but its official name now is the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So we used to call it COVID-19 or coronavirus, but the official name of the virus is SARS-CoV-2. It causes an infectious disease named COVID-19, which is the disease process, the disease itself. And it's important because we actually had a SARS-CoV-1 a few years ago that was also started in China. So in any case, this is a similar type virus. It's just been much more virulent in the way it's presented around the world. Next slide. So what I try to do as a physician, I try to kind of keep track a little bit of what's going on in the world and in the US, state by state, and in our own counties in my state in North Carolina. And one of the websites that's great for that information is the Johns Hopkins Hospital System's website. And that gives a lot of information day to day, as does the Worldometer info. And I think that gives you a good global perspective too. But as of yesterday, we had 1.2 million some cases in the US. So it's going to continue to grow, and it's also going to continue to grow because of the amount of testing we're now all doing in each of our states. And it's going to continue to grow in different countries. And there are some third world countries particularly that they say are not going to reach their peak for 4 to 6 months from now. So I think we have to think about sailing on a global level, and then also in the US and more locally. I mean, obviously we're all doing a great job trying to flatten the curve, and I think that's gone well in a lot of states. Obviously certain areas up north have had some bigger difficulties, in New York particularly. But I think most everyone's tried to flatten the curve as best possible, and we've done an okay job. And as states try to reopen and really get everyone back to their daily lives, we have to make sure we try to avoid resurgence and a second wave. They said that in 1918, in the Spanish flu epidemic, that the most lives and mortality, morbidity were significant in the second wave, not the first wave. So, and that has to do more with people just thinking they're back to normal, and they're really still needing to be cautious. So we have to keep up our preventative measures and really be diligent with that. And we have to play by our state to state guidelines. Every state is different, as we know. Even every county and certain areas and pockets in every state is different. So we are going to need to try to pay attention to that, and not just say we're opening up, but we need to continue that and make sure that we avoid any kind of, peak again. So it's really going to be important to continue to do those things. Next slide. So how do we safely return to our sport? This is a big question that we've got to try to address, whether it's single-handed, double-handed, or multi-crew. We've got to come up with some plans. Next. So we've started with the return to sport guidelines. Now, there are multiple different guidelines that are out there. The U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee has guidelines for event planning and management. They were put out about 3 or 4 weeks ago. The CMO, the Chief Medical Officer, is one of my colleagues, Dr. John Finoff. And they did a good job going through this and trying to address their centers of excellence and their athletes who are training on their own or traveling or trying to train together. So that's a good document to look at some things. I'll mention a couple of things from that. There's also an NCAA core principles of resocialization in college sports, and that NCAA document just was released a couple of weeks ago. World Sailing has put out guidance and advice documents, and those are available on the World Sailing website. And Dr. Ben Tan, who is one of my colleagues in Singapore, they've done a great job with their medical commission trying to address these things from a more global perspective. And they follow a lot of World Health Organization and CDC advice, as we should all do, of course. And then there's other NGBs that are putting out their own things, like the U.S. Tennis Association, and then the American Camp Association has guidelines for clubs, et cetera. And I think looking at all of those over time as you get back into your programs and to sailing in the summer and through the fall is going to be helpful. Next. So this is Dr. Finoff's document. I just want to show you what it looks like. So if you go to the website, you can find it on the USOPC website under the news and COVID-19. And it's, like I said, it's a good document. It's really a little bit more directed towards elite athletes, but it does give some good ideas about event planning and what you need to consider as you go forward. Next. The summary of that guideline from my perspective, though, that I thought was important for sailing is that sailing is considered a low risk sport in the single-handed category and a moderate risk sport if group sailing, a group being 2 or more. So the risk goes up just a little bit in their summary of all their different sports. So different sports are high risk. For instance, boxing is a high risk sport category. So it goes through it and strategizes each of the sports. And I think that's important to look at because you can kind of compare it to rowing or canoe, kayak, et cetera, with sailing and some of our individual sports versus group-based sailing boats. It uses World Health Organization mass event guidelines to make your recommendations to return to any type of larger regatta events. And those mass event guidelines are actually pretty well drawn out. Those are also referred to in the World Sailing document. The other thing that USOPC recommends that every sport do, and really I'm going to recommend every club do, is that you develop a medical team with some education, screening, and communication that can help every one of your members and students and staff pull together on all this. Okay, next. So this is the World Sailing website, and you can see, if you can see the slide, he's got advice on novel coronavirus, multiple different guidance to event organization, risk assessment decision tree, novel coronavirus, et cetera. The matrix of the stratification of the risk assessment is all in there. So, and I think it's all good information. Next slide. And then this is the NCAA core principles, resocialization of college sport. So there's some good information in this. Next slide. And in summary, the World Sailing and NCAA slides, basically World Sailing follows the World Health Organization and adds some basic hygiene recommendations, medical monitoring, limiting gathering for sailing awards, for instance, holding protest hearings in large rooms and not in close proximity, outdoors if possible, and having all meetings outdoors. So those were recommended on the World Sailing documents. And the NCAA basically follows the phase 1, 2, 3 reopening guidelines. And it's just very much with that as far as having any kind of sporting events in general. Okay, next. So some specific suggestions that we've sort of discussed within the Sports Medicine Committee, I just want to run over. Team up with the same person or persons when you're doing your regatta and try not to change, or your classes or as you go forward. Maintain your social distances when possible, and this includes coaches and race committee and sailors when possible. And use a face mask on shore, and consider it while sailing, but at least in a multi-boat, not necessarily when you're individually. But it kind of depends on you know, how many of those people you're sailing with your family, or you sailing with your roommate that you're around all the time. But for the most part, they do recommend that we use a mask. And I want to just show everybody a couple things on a mask while I'm thinking about it. This is an N95 mask. N95 mask means that 95% of the particles will not get through this mask. It's thick, covered, etc. So 95% of particulate matter will not get through. That's why hospital physicians, nurses, etc. have to have these. I don't recommend that anybody just goes out and gets those. This is a surgical mask. This is what I actually use in the clinic on a little more regular basis. And then, you know, your home mask. The surgical mask and the home mask are not going to prevent as much particulate matter getting through, but it may help some with the smaller aerosol spray and some of the larger droplets getting further. So it will protect you from spreading anything to other people. It may or may not protect you from getting anything. And we have had some discussion about buffs. Buffs are more porous, so more particles are going to get through, but it still might be helpful as opposed to not having anything. Okay, next. I do think that from a gear perspective, having all of your own gear is the best thing. If you show up to go sailing, you have all your gear, your life jackets, your hats, your sails, your boat designated, etc. That is a better situation. If you are using other boats, I think it is appropriate for you to have one assigned for you the whole time if possible. And if not, either way, you need to clean up after each use with disinfectant. Soap and water is good. Alcohol and bleach might be better, but it certainly needs to be cleaned after each use. Do not share your gear, water bottles, food, etc. And someone, I believe Betsy Allison actually suggested using full finger gloves. And I think that's a great idea. We use gloves all the time in medicine. I don't think it's a bad idea. Then you're touching what you're touching. So that's something to think about. Next. I do think it's recommended for clubs if you'll post like the top guidelines like OSHA training does, and train your staff to follow those guidelines and teach them to the members and the students. I think that's helpful. So sometimes posting a sign that just says wash your hands will be helpful. Again, develop a medical team and a plan for reporting in case there's an issue. And I think some clubs are considering using medical forms that include any type of exposure and an ability to trace backwards if you have a problem. So obviously cleanliness and hygiene at club facilities is key. And I'm sure though, the CDC guidelines definitely go through all of that. Next. So in North Carolina, we have the 3 W's, and I'm going to end on this because I thought it's really interesting. That's Paige Riley wearing her face mask in Brazil, her buff. But the 3 W's: wear, wait, and wash. So wear a face covering, wait 6 feet apart, and wash your hands frequently. Next. And my 3 W's are wind, water, and waves, and let's go sailing. So I hope that's helpful, and we'll take questions at the end.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ann. Yeah, I think we'll have some good questions at the end. And I know that the Sports Medicine Committee is continuing to think about all this stuff, and we appreciate your leadership on all that. So next, we're going to move on to the sort of regatta environment, and I'll turn it over to Mark Townsend. Oh, Mark, I think you're still on mute.
Thank you very much. There we go. Just as an introduction as to how we approach this, what we did is we sort of looked at what are the things that SARS-CoV-2 we have to do in order to remain safe, and then how do you overlay those into a regatta environment. So if we go to the next slide. Oh, so as safe harbor, I'm not a professional, medical, legal, insurance, or anything else. Anything I say is my best knowledge. If you want professional, medical, legal advice, go consult your judge advocate or your doctor, or other than that. Hopefully the guidelines are helpful to you. Next slide. So what you need to do, first and foremost, I would say, is follow your local, state, and federal guidelines. And then using those and understanding those, try and move forward with regatta organization. So what we did is we looked at what the environment does to us, and we need to provide an environment that protects everyone. It protects your employees at the club, your volunteers, your competitors, your coaches, and everybody else. There are about 4 CDC documents which we found particularly interesting. There's a document on hand washing, space to social distance, face coverings, and cleaning of various public environments. So if you take those things and then try and lay those on top of your normal regatta, what does that do to you? Probably the big thing is, so first of all, you got to provide ability to wash hands, sanitize advance, use hand cleaners locally. Then you get into social distancing. Although our sport is supposedly a solitary sport, when you get ashore, it's actually a relatively social shore. So you look ashore and you've got various things that you need to figure out how you deal with. On-site registration, normally when somebody comes to a regatta, they come into on-site registration. There's usually a great crowd in there of people registering, picking up sailing instructions, picking up dinner tickets and things like that. That simply is going to have to change. So you have to figure out, how am I going to do those things in a socially distancing environment? Competitors meetings, you also need to look at those. We'll go into more details on these. Social events. So you're going to be able to run social events during this time. What do you do with protests? How do you launch boats? What do you do with the protest presentation? Then going afloat, how many people do you got on a roast committee boat, signal boat? Are you going to put your usual 10 people on there, all standing next to each other, or are you going to have to cut it down to more, 4 or 5 people? Signal boat, what do you do on mark set boats? What do you do on safety boats? And how do you go about rescuing somebody who's capsized? These all provide interactions that you need to manage social distancing from. Next thing we think was very important is communication. Make sure you provide timely communication. If you have expectations of people who are coming to an event, you need to communicate those before they get there. If you want them to wear a face mask in order to enter the venue, you need to tell them that before they get to the gate to the clubhouse and try and get into the clubhouse or club grounds. What are the protocols that we want them to follow within the venue? Putting signage around the venue, wash your hands, stay 6 feet apart, keeping reminding those people. Social distancing enforcement. If people refuse to wear masks or refuse to social distance, how do you handle those situations? And also, many of the clubs have employees that you have different regulations around. So make sure you understand your OSHA regs around that you've got to deal with in that way. And finally, on this sort of what you need to think about, emergency response plan. We all have emergency response plans for lightning strikes. What if somebody gets cut in the boat? You need to go through and update it as to, well, what happens if I find an employee or a volunteer or a competitor who's showing signs of COVID-19? What's my plan? How do I deal with that? And then do I have a method if that ever occurs of doing contact tracing? Probably need to look about having somebody as a safety officer, and putting somebody in that position may not be the best, most popular job to take, but good luck on finding somebody. Next slide. So on this one, back to basics. So what we're thinking of here is what are we going to do with sailing when we go out? How can you run sailing? So there's a club local down here close to a beach which made national news a few days ago, where they actually haven't stopped racing. They've had races occurring every Saturday all the way through. But then when you actually look at the details of what they're doing, these are boats that are tied up in front of people's houses, that are generally sailed by a couple who are sheltering together, racing around marks that are fixed in place. So clearly, I think you can do that amount of sailing relative, as soon as you get some restrictions lifted and actually getting out of the house. There's very little interaction with people that you're not already had some interaction. Social distancing, you meet, and you sort of check all the boxes on the things you've got to do. So watch the state restrictions on boating. California has some state restrictions on boating. Make sure you understand them and that you comply with those restrictions. And as Dr. Ann said, single-handed racing is a lot easier. So kiteboards and windsurfing and laser sailing and optimist sailing, where there's one person in a boat, maintains that social distancing. As soon as you start adding more people into the boats, double-handed boats or triple-handed or 50-foot boats with 10 people on it, you increase the number of people, you increase the number of risk. So those, I think, we're looking at further down the line of how do you get those back on board. I think I missed one point off that first slide, but I'll go back to in a second. So sailing around fixed marks, another thing you might think of, which reduces the number of people that you need on a race committee boat, is using the audible signal racing system. That's the collegiate whistle system, 3 whistles for 3 minutes, 2 whistles for 2 minutes. It eliminates the need of class flags. If you have many of the timing boxes, they do that for you automatically. So it reduces the number of people you need to put on a race committee boat together. The point I missed, I think, on the previous slide was assess your risk tolerance. So having thought of all these things you need to do, what's your stomach for risk? Can you provide an environment that allows competitors, volunteers to protect themselves and stay distance? If you can't, then maybe it's time to wait a bit more. What's your risk tolerance as an organization? Do you reputational risk? What liability you have? The GARI document just came out today. It might be worth having a read through that. What does your insurance cover? That was one of the questions our group asked to GARI. We didn't get an answer. I guess a response came out to try and give us one. And also, what's your financial flexibility if the event gets cancelled at the last minute, if there is a flare-up back of the pandemic? And if in doubt, check with your judge advocate. I'm sure he will set you on a course that you might, well, he will feel safe with. Next slide. Okay, so what we thought we had here, what we're trying to suggest here is how do we return to sailing? And we sort of broke it up into 3 slots. Aggressive, so we have a padlock on one end, which indicates we're still in lockdown. But once we come out of that, which many of the states are starting to do, then what can we do? You're going to start in a period of aggressive social distancing, followed by moderate social distancing, followed by limited social distancing. Along with that, there's all sorts of travel restrictions and other things that occur. So initially, we think the first thing you're going to be able to do is get to some form of club sailing around fixed marks. People, sailing off, not having a competitors meeting, not having a social event afterwards, but just going out, going sailing, coming back ashore, and going home, basically, maintain social distancing. We think that that can resume relatively quickly. Whether you can do the beer can racing with 10 people on a boat, it's a little more tricky. You might find that when you start trying to satisfy those gates that you're not going to, you'll find that difficult to do. As we move through moderate distancing, we sort of put junior programs underneath. There was a separate presentation that I think Jessica and a group did in that area, and I'm sure she'll talk some more about that. But then on the top area of regattas, then you start to get to regional regattas. This is looking at more regattas where people are starting to travel to the regatta. They're looking to stay somewhere at the regatta, but it's not traveling cross country. So we believe that'll be the next sort of phase of opening up, where you're running invitational regattas, but the invitations are limited to clubs within the local area. Then as you move on further on that, you get into some other issues around national regattas, continental regattas, and world regattas. In the case of national regattas, if you take the example of Florida and Ohio, both of which up until very recently have had quarantining requirements that if you come into their state, you have to quarantine for 2 weeks. So a competitor who wants to go to an event in Ohio from Florida will travel there 2 weeks before the event, quarantine themselves for 2 weeks, sail the event for 3 days, turn around, go back to Florida, quarantine themselves for another 2 weeks, and it just isn't practical. So you've got to get rid of some of those travel restrictions and quarantining requirements before you're getting into national regattas. Then as you move to continental regattas, and I'm looking at sort of Canada, Mexico, Caribbean coming in, you've got to get away from some of these restrictions across the whole continental area before you can resume continental regattas. And then world regattas become even more complex, because you got to, to make it a fair competition, you need to allow people from all over the world to come to a world championship. Next slide. Oh, we seem to have dropped a slide, but okay, so what I had, there was a whole bunch of considerations, and I'll just work my way through some of them quickly. Before you conduct the event, you need to look at how many attendees are going to be there. If you got an event that's going to have 300 or 400 people, how are you going to, what are the conditions that the local, state, or feds have got in place. Can you accommodate those people and meet those guidelines? Boat storage and moorage. So if you've got a boat park and you need to provide additional space around boats, you're probably going to very quickly find that the number of boats you can store in your moorage is reduced by 50 to 70%. Another one, race official housing. Often you bring in race officials from out of state or out of town, and you put them up in a member's housing. You know, a member, I'm not sure how many people will be keen on housing the judge from Germany or the umpire from New York currently. So some of that you've got to think about. There are events, one in particular I can think of, and a US sailing one, where you have to provide competitor housing. How are you going to do that in the current environment where you're suddenly going to need to find 80 beds or 100 beds to put competitors in, and you got to do that within your members' houses, or you're going to put them in a hotel. The hotel will probably could defeat you financially, and they putting it in members' houses will probably, you just won't find enough members who are willing to do that. So think through that. I would say plan for a postponement or cancellation. So work on the basis your event's going to get canceled and plan accordingly. And then you won't be disappointed if it does, and you'll be excited if it doesn't. If you've got sponsorship that you need in order to run your event, check with your sponsors. They feel comfortable with having their name associated with an event that may, you know, who knows what happens. And then make sure for each event you have a go, no-go decision and a time frame. Make sure you update your emergency response plan. We talked a little bit about that. Match racing and team racing events. You swap boats generally in these types of events. So if you go through and do a collegiate team racing where you're swapping boats multiple times a day, how do you disinfect the boats when one team comes out of it and another team comes in? With umpires, where you're swapping umpires and you've got two umpires who in the same boat, does that work? Do you need to go to a strategy where you have single umpires per boat? What about exclusion of competitors? If you have a competitor that you decide you need to exclude, how do you do that within the act, within the rules? How do you avoid getting foul of the Ted Stevens Act? Do you have enough restrooms? Just simple stuff like that on your facility if you're going to close down. And then have you got a plan to isolate anybody on site who may be symptomatic? And how do you eliminate at-risk staff and volunteers and thank them very much and either keep them isolated within the event or just not include them? You need to think through your notice board. Having the normal putting pins in a cork board and having a group of people gathering around them is not going to work. Look at being online notice boards. Signals made ashore won't work quite the same way it used to before because you're going to be trying to get people off the venue. So putting a flag up on a flagpole isn't going to be very informative. So how do you let people know that you've made signals ashore? Results are pretty, lots of people put results up on websites. You need to continue doing that. Probably don't post them ashore. Competitors meetings, they're not mandatory attend, so don't have them. There are certain race officers in California who'd be thrilled to hear that. Protest committees, how do you run a protest committee and put 5 people and 2, a protestee, a protestor, or a witness? You need to look at how you're going to run those things virtually. There's some guidance that US Sailing has put out about running them on a virtual basis. Make sure your chief umpire or judge is aware of that. How do people file protests? Do you get rid of the traditional protest desk and allow them to file those things online? And notice of protests, you also need a process of putting those up online. Then once you get out on the water, How do you make sure race committee staffing is limited? If you've got marked out staffing, make sure you put the same people in the same boat for the entire days. Figure out how you're going to do safety boats. If you have to rescue somebody, do you wear masks? What do they do about masks? And then finally, I thought a good picture to grab your attention. So make sure you're comfortable to proceed. This was a picture of the start of the Transpac race in 2015. We just had a 40-degree wind shift, and I thought my troubles were over. And then we got a lightning strike. Fortunately, nobody got hit, but I think it's something that we can plan our way through and get back to sailing, but it's some thinking that people haven't traditionally done in the sailing area. I encourage you to think through it. The document that's coming out has more things to think about rather than giving you prescriptive ways of doing things, because we think that will actually provide a better solution, because there won't be one solution that fits everybody. Anyway, I thank you for your time, and I'll pass it back to John.
Super. Thank you, Mark. Yeah, I think this image is fitting. This is a bit what it feels like right now. But as you said, we have the tools to get through this. I'm excited for this next little segment here from Brad Reid, because so much of this hinges on navigating the government and government guidance. So take it away, Brad.
Hey, thanks, John. And first of all, thank you for US Sailing for having these webinars. It's great to have them on. And I think this is an opportunity for all of us to simplify our sport and not just talk about racing. Let's talk about sailing. US sailing is sailing. It's not US racing. And let's think about how we can simplify the message to all sailors in the United States to enjoy sailing for a while and not necessarily worry about the complexity that is a major regatta. In many states like Ohio, you can only go sailing with family members or people under your own roof. Pretty much limits to what you can do. And I encourage, whether it's Cleveland Yachting Club or, the Edgewood group or anybody in any of the inland lakes, use your club boats, figure out how to run some races for families and really work together as a community to identify these opportunities. We want to teach hundreds of kids sailing like we always do. We want to have an amazing world championship like we plan for years and years to do. We want to do all those things. And we know that due to many things outside of our control, we're not going to do them. So I named my slide, this is my only slide, and you're welcome to delete it and put somebody's face up there, I don't care, is proactive planning through reactivity and communicating with our friends in government, because this is a fluid situation. And to say that it's fluid is probably the most massive understatement we could possibly think of. And just brought up so many different great points of how this thing could go in the future. How this could develop. We don't know. But what we do know are these different stages of this pandemic and the different phases of the government allowing things to be open provide opportunities. And I guess we're looking at this not as a sailing club, not as a sailing organization, but we're looking at this directly one way, and that's as a business. We are taking every single opportunity that we have to connect with the governmental officials that are controlling business. Because ultimately, if we can't control our businesses and open our shops, we can't do anything. We can't do anything. So it's important to think about it that way and understand where everyone's jurisdictions are. There's a governor, there's a municipal leadership, there's an organization that runs your harbors and your waterways. There's an organization, a Department of Health. And in our case, there's a commerce department that brings it all together and tells organizations what they can and cannot do and what the guidelines are. Do you have to wear masks? Do you have to have 6 foot of social distancing? How many people can be together in a group? And let me just say, having the cell phone numbers of as many leadership personnel in your state is a good thing. And we're very fortunate through the Volvo Ocean races that we've run, through the America's Cup World Series, and through many, many of the events that we have really good contacts with our state officials. And I think, you know, and again, this is kind of conversational. So John, if you want to ask any specific questions, please do. It was so good at the beginning to reach out and talk to our DEM leadership, our Department of Environmental Management, that runs the waterways and happens to be our leaseholder at Fort Adams State Park, if they needed any advice or counsel or help, even to proofread something. Is there any questions you would have? And what happened is they started opening up and really allowing us a little input. Not a lot, and we're not asking for a lot. We just want to understand how they're thinking, what they're thinking. We're in our downtime of year. We're in April. It's pretty cold here. No one's sailing yet. We had some time to develop some ideas. So just simply by reaching out to these folks, we got a dialogue going. Dean Hoxie, who's the chief of law enforcement, runs the waterways. His environmental police, they were freaked out that we were going to run a regatta, and what they thought of as a regatta was like a Volvo Ocean race stopover. It's like, no. A regatta could be a bunch of families sailing J22s around. A regatta could be a single-handed event. A regatta will not have social events until you tell us we can effectively have a social event. So really proactive planning by reacting to the current phase you're in. Like I said, we have a governor who's been great. She sets the tone and she sets the executive orders. The Department of Environmental Management runs the waterways and then works with local harbor masters to understand, and they work together to maintain those rules and regulations. The Department of Health has the authority over the guidelines on how businesses are run and how we need to clean, screen our employees, screen our patrons, have a crisis communication of what if one of our employees or a patron contracts COVID-19, and how do we deal with that going forward, and how do we, it's very specific and it changes. So understanding the dynamic of the change, reacting to those changes, and putting documents together. So the business regulation is the first thing all of us should be thinking about. Having a big giant regatta is secondary. And just see if you can open your doors. Marinas in Rhode Island, we were very fortunate that marinas stayed open for the most part. Yacht clubs were kind of dormant still. It was the early spring, but now they're coming alive. And the yacht clubs and the marinas had an advocacy group on their behalf. And we have a very strong Rhode Island Marine Trades Association who went out and specifically started telling the Commerce Department, these are important areas of our economy, and working with the Commerce Department to make sure that those marine entities stayed open. Now, are there problems? Yeah, everyone's got problems. We have a customs issue right now where people can't come into southeastern New England. We have folks calling our federal delegation to try to see if we can get that softened up a bit. We're continuing to work with our harbor masters to say, is this possible? Kim Hapgood, our program director, and Nick Ewenson, our racing program director, they are working, I think, with Jessica and Ann on what could a smaller version of our youth program be. And we're creating those documents and floating them to our governmental partners. And by doing it that way, we're not saying this is what we're going to do. I don't want to hear it. We're going to yell at you if you don't let us do it. That's not what we're doing. This could be possible. And this is an opportunity within what we feel your guidelines are. So, are we going to have 140 kids doing beginners, intermediate racing programs all at once by August? I'm not sure. I don't think so. But what we are doing is making sure that we look at the phases, and everyone can do this. You can go onto your commerce websites, you can go onto your state's websites and look at your phases and see what is possible within the phases, and then plan accordingly. Are we all going to take an economic hit? Yes, 100%. Making sure you're on top of things like PPP, things like making sure you're ahead of the game and getting your personal protection equipment. Make sure your signs are pre-laminated so that when you can go back to business, you've got your signage all around your site. You know, and again, I want to get back to where we were, you know, last summer. Last summer was amazing. We had a J20, we had a 12-meter worlds. We had all these incredible regattas here in town. We want to get back to that, but we're not going to get back to that right away. So think about what you can do to open as a business first, and then work forward from there. And keep, if you have a cell phone of any of the leaders, use it. Call them. Ask them how they're doing. Ask them, hey, is there anything we can do to help? You know, you have a sounding board here. Don't just think we're out to open up and be huge right away. We'll do it incrementally, and we'll do it with you, and we'll do it beside you, not out front. And you know, I guess that's my message.
That's fantastic, Brad. And I think I love the idea of reaching out and being in the loop, being a sounding board, being someone who can help review ideas from the government. And that will allow, you know, a lot more collaboration. And I also think it's great, you know, from what Sail Newport has been doing and so many different sailing organizations around the country, collaborating with their regional programs, the other smaller clubs that also need this information, and sharing and pooling that knowledge. So I do want to pitch everybody to, you know, wherever you are in the country, get together with the other organizations near you and start sharing the information about what you're doing.
Yeah, and that's a great point, John, because early on, I asked Matt Duggan, who's our race management director, to come up with a simple idea of what a regatta could be. And, you know, Craig Lewick put it up on Scuttlebutt, and we appreciate that. But what it did is, like I said before, it really eased the anxiety of the leadership that we weren't going to go out and run a gigantic regatta. First of all, the optics are terrible right now. You can't have a pickup 5-on-5 basketball game in the state of Rhode Island. So, you know, the big sailor people down on the water, we should not be out there trying to run big regattas right now, even if they're single-handed. We have to take incremental steps. And by Matt creating that document, we floated it out to the NBYA community, which is Narragansett Bay Yachting Association. We sent it to the Marine leadership at DEM, and they thanked us. They thanked the community, not just us. They thanked the community for thinking about this as one, as opposed to each individual yacht club going around, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. So working with IDA, with New York, with Connecticut, with Barrington Yacht Club, Bristol Yacht Club, Wickford Yacht Club, Saunderstown, et cetera, we have a really good collective voice in this state. Now, granted, we can put our arms around our state, but think of what we're doing in your local harbor, or, you know, in San Francisco Bay versus, you know, all of California, San Diego Harbor versus Mission Bay. You know, you're going to have to do these things slightly different from municipality to municipality.
Perfect. Well, Brad, I think there's going to be some good questions for you in the chat box here. And we're just going to move on to our last section here from Jessica Haverstock. And Jess has been the chair of the U.S. Sailing's Instructor and Coaches Committee for the last little over a year. And she's been very involved with our junior sailing program focus group that we had a session yesterday on the Starboard portal, and we put up some guidance on the website to help junior sailing programs get started. So this is a bit of a second go around for Jess, and I'm going to take a couple of different points here from her point of view in Lake Minnetonka. So take it away, Jess.
Thanks, John. And Brad, thanks for that, because I think, as he noted, it's really important to talk with talk with your community members, get engaged. And US Sailing just put out a video, as Pierce mentioned yesterday, that details some of junior sailing's recommendations, and also a forum that you can get on and have more questions answered. So really my goal here is just to kind of provide you with a quick checklist as you are getting towards hopefully opening the doors this summer, and just things that you can start continuing to talk about and think about and work with your key staff members and board of directors going forward. So at LMSS and talking with some other organizations, we've found it really helpful to split up into 3 groups and report on these things weekly. So the first one that we're reporting on is communication. And that's just simply that you're communicating timely and making sure that you're talking with your customers and staff on a regular basis. And these kind of questions below are how we're starting to frame those emails and communications going out. So we found it really helpful to address what we know today, how it impacts you, what we don't know yet, and that timeline for future updates, and what we need from you now and going forward. So our registration would be a good example of that. Hey, summer's still coming. We're hopeful and we're going to be opening our doors. We don't have an answer for you yet, but we should know more information by May 15th. Please continue to register, and you'll find that link here. That's been extremely helpful for us, and also just making sure that any of those communications are staying positive. And yesterday there was a great conversation again. Will, one of the youth sailors, continued to remind us that kids and family members are looking forward to getting out on the water, and we're all hopeful that we can get out at some point in some capacity this summer. So. Pierce, next slide. The next group we're reporting on is sailing and facility logistics. And maybe these again are just good questions to ask your board of directors, ask your staff members, get people together to start talking about. Others on this panel have already talked a little bit about understanding your governance and who you're getting direction from, reaching out to those individuals, picking up the phone and asking questions of them. Again, health and safety guidelines. For us in Minnesota, we're looking at the Minnesota Department of Health and the CDC. They do have a hotline you can call and have been very helpful in answering any questions that we have via their hotline. And I have heard, and rumor has it, that the CDC will be releasing a little bit more information too, specifically on youth camps and programs here in the next week. So take a look there. Reviewing your fleet, it was mentioned and discussed quite a bit about single-handed sailing being phase 1. Understand how you can adapt your boats, look at your classroom space, making sure that if need be, and going inside of the classrooms, which hopefully you'll be outside most days, that you have the appropriate space for the kids that you have at your facility. Again, just asking the question, how can you minimize touch points, high traffic areas, managing flow and transportation logistics, as well as, again, worst case scenario, inclement weather, review those safety plans and understand what you are going to do, whether you're choosing to cancel classes in advance, 24 hours in advance, or again, do you have a safe spot to move your kids inside if necessary? And the last group that we're reporting on weekly, and this one's a hot topic, but constantly reevaluating our budget. And that is within now, for us, we're looking at phase 1 being single-handed sailing. What does that look like? How many kids and how many instructors? So evaluating our labor and our costs that will go into that. we've had a lot of luck working with our local insurance company cutting costs. And I thank our board members for really helping us out there, providing information and knowing kind of what questions to ask, but reducing liability coverage on our equipment. We've shut a lot of our kind of facility down in a way, and we'll turn it back on when those classes reopen. And again, just understanding that as your staff changes, the numbers change, and also their job descriptions change, you may want to ask the question too in terms of workers' compensation and what that may look like for you. And lastly, there have been a lot of conversations, a lot of resources regarding funding, and that's everything from the PPP, the EIDL, local grants, and upcoming fundraisers. And also some really creative ideas that have come up. And so I would just encourage you again to keep that in mind of fundraising and also your community grants. We found some success there and continue to circle back on those conversations on a regular basis. As noted, Brad did a nice job of talking about this. For me as a director, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know a whole lot about insurance, but we've really connected with our board of directors, locals, individuals in the club who have been able to advise us on these things. So again, looking to lawyers, finance committees, individuals that can help you with those liability and waiver forms. It's been an incredible lifesaver on my end and very extremely helpful. Align, with other sailing schools, get together, have discussions, check in, talk with your yacht clubs, and US Sailing again is putting out some really great information. So keep up to date on the portal and keep watching some of those videos. I personally have already taken away a lot of tips and tricks from those, so there's a lot to learn. And as all of us have all said, stay flexible, do the best you can to plan with the facts you have today. It's constantly changing, and you can only do so much, but we hope and we plan, and we're staying positive for sailing this summer.
Awesome. Thank you, Jess. And yes, this is all evolving quite a lot. So, we do have some of these junior sailing program resources that we've created so far. We have a large working group of over 30 people at this point from all across the country. So there is a presentation on the Starboard portal from yesterday, as well as this guidance document on the US Sailing website. And for the Q&A session here, because I recognize we're kind of right at the edge here of our time, but we're going to go into overtime because we might as well. But I want to point out that this US Sailing Leadership Forum Facebook page is brand new. It's only been up for a day, and there's already 300 something people in there. So this is really where your Q&A can continue. And, keep in mind that the questions that you ask in here are also going to be potentially adopted into some of these guidance documents or help spark the discussion. So while we have our Q&A on camera here, feel free to go into the Sailing Leadership Forum Facebook group. So I was keeping track of the chat box. Right now, there's a great conversation about how to best serve beer, but I think we'll let people figure that one out on the Facebook group. But Dr. Allen, I want to ask your opinion. I know that these are hard answers to give, but what's your opinion on the best way to disinfect shared areas, shared equipment? For example, the hoist, the launch ramp, the boat. I know there's a lot of different ways to do it, but what would you suggest? Oh, you're still on mute, Ann. Sorry.
Thank you. Sorry. Interestingly, we just had a discussion about the hoist at my yacht club at Carolina Yacht Club yesterday, because we were all going to try to go and consider sailing the Lightnings in our family group. But I think if the hoist is used, really, if we keep gloves and hand sanitizer around the hoist, I think that's better. I mean, I think most hoists are waterproof, so that's not necessarily an electrical issue. You could wash it, but I think if you use gloves and then hand sanitizers, and also maybe limit who uses the hoist, and I mean, who's actually controlling it. I think that would be helpful. But, you know, gloves are, even just medical gloves are easy to get and use, and they're disposable and you can be done with that. I think that's fine. You could also use your sailing gloves, really, as long as you wash them after you're done with that. But that's, I think Betsy, Allison, and I were discussing full-fingered sailing gloves as something that might be helpful. And I do think that's something that could be used, and they would need to be washed after each use, or you could use disposable medical gloves that can be thrown away. So I think those would be good. On the ramps themselves, I think as long as you can keep your distance, that's helpful. But any kind of shared boating equipment definitely needs to be cleaned after every use. And I think there's a good bit of debate about sunlight and whether or not sunlight is going to kill the virus. Well, the reality is there's different types of UV rays, A, B, and C, and the C waves are the ones that apparently kill more, but they don't usually get through to our level of the earth. It's usually A and B. They still probably are going to get rid of some components of the virus, but we really don't have enough information about this particular virus and how quickly it's going to be disappearing from sunlight and or heat. So I think the best decision is to wash all of your gear. If you don't have anything but soap and water, that's better than nothing. Is, you know, maybe Clorox and or 60% alcohol better? Probably a mix of that. That's probably a better solution. But I think soap and water is great too, if that's all you have.
Yeah, that's a toughie, and I imagine there'll be more and more research done about the effects of sunlight, salt water, fresh water, etc.
Yeah.
We're just going to do a couple more questions because I know we've gone over a little, but this one I think would be for both Mark and Brad probably. What are some creative ideas for running a race, club racing, with sort of maximum social distancing?
Well, first, don't have a social, number one. Just don't have anything on land. Have people, if you're going to use, for our example, if it's a laser regatta, you cordon off the field and you make sure there's plenty of signage, stay 6 feet apart as you're launching off the beach or off the ramp, and see you on the water, come back in, people disperse, no more drinking beer in the parking lot. You know who you are, Fleet 413. And off you go. And then in terms of like family sailing on, if it's S boats and they're in the mooring field and they're being used on the mooring, hey, we'll see you out there. We'll have a person in a mark boat and a person on a signal boat. We'll run some races for you and then see you the following week. And remember, you've signed a document saying you're sailing with only your household until that changes. J22s. We have 14 J22s. We're planning family sailing and family racing opportunities and people under the same household. And you're going to park between the soccer fields. You're going to come down, get your gear for that night, go to your boat, leave the dock, and make sure we have as much social distancing as we can, and have procedures, policies, and signage that make sense, that don't say what you can't do. They should say what you can do. And that's where we're heading with this.
Mark, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, one other thing that we're looking at, we have a Olympic classes regatta scheduled at the end of July, which we're kind of scratching our head over at the moment. But some of the thinking is, so in order to maximize the number of boats you can get out there while minimizing the amount of interaction, is to sail one group from noon to 2, and then have another group come out at pick up at 2, and they sail from 2 to 4 or something. So then you get half the number of people in the boat park at any one time. When they get ashore, you tell them to thanks very much, go home, have a Zoom cocktail party or whatever. But then you're able to get a few more people out there, but you're still doing that basic minimizing how you run the event, the number of people that are interacting. It's the ashore pieces that are the difficult pieces to manage. Competitors meeting, trophy presentation, just trying to launch your boat. You know, you got 150 opties going down a ramp.
Don't have 150 opties. Don't.
Right. Well, yeah, exactly. And the ramp is going to be very long at 6 feet spaces between each of them.
I really do think that all of us have to think smaller. We need to think smaller I'm not just because I'm short and my brother always tells me that, but because that's our opportunity. Where do our opportunities lie? The opportunities lie with sailing, family sailing, with club boats that are
Yep.
cleaned properly and not thinking about anything besides that for the short term. And let's do it.
Yeah,
Do what we can do.
yeah, I think the one thing sort of I had in my that's in our document is that you're going to run club regattas for the foreseeable future. Getting up to regional regattas is a little more difficult because you get, you know, the more people you try and get at an event, the more difficult it is. Stay small, stay safe, and stay home. Sail at your own
Absolutely.
club.
Or let's
And-
just go sailing. Let's just go sailing. That's what I like that Brad's saying is the reality is we don't have to have regattas. We can, and we can all just do Corinthian sailing if you want to race a little bit, and that's fine. But I think the most important thing is at this point, I think a lot of people have been inside for a long time. Let's just get people outside and in a boat and
Yep.
enjoying the water and the wind and the waves as best we can. And hopefully we'll be able to get back to the other part, but just be smart, be safe, pay attention to each other, and be courteous about hand washing. So, you know, again, the 3 W's.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point to end on. And I really think that there's a lot of silver linings for our sailing community if we've searched them out. And please reach out to US Sailing with the questions that you need answers to. There's work going on in all areas, whether it's medical, liability, program structure. It's not going to have all of the answers for every situation, but we definitely want to provide guidance and ideas. And it's so clear that our community has so many great ideas within it. So bring them all together and share them and get back out on the water, like Ann said. So thank you, Dr. Allen. Thank you, Brad, Jess, and Mark. And thanks everybody for tuning in. I'm sure we'll see you soon.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go sailing.